Welcome to Postcards to the Universe with Melisa Caprio. Do you believe in magic? What if you were told that all you had to do was get a little creative and work a magic spell to bring anything you can imagine into your life? Here on Postcards to the Universe, we will share manifesting, tips, postcards, creativity, abundance, and prosperity. Here is your host, Melisa Caprio.
Hello, welcome to Postcards to the Universe with Melisa, creating the life you crave. How's everyone doing? I hope well. Just take a couple of minutes. I don't know what happened. I wasn't there. I could hear my producer. He couldn't hear me. So I hope you guys can hear me now. I have no idea what that was because seriously, my mic was not muted. I was looking at it. So who knows? I know what it was. Mercury retrograde. Yes, that's what it was. And I'm a Gemini, so of course. But I have a great guest today, author Claire Willis, and we're going to talk about her book, Opening to Grief, Finding Your Way from Loss to Peace. And I'm just going to bring Claire out in a few minutes. You guys know who join my show every week. I like to talk for the first few minutes about my thoughts, and I create a postcard, a Magic Monday message about an affirmation and a manifesting postcard that I get. And I pick an affirmation each week that I like to focus on, and this week's is I cherish the moments. This postcard was sent to me, and I worked on photographing it. And when I'm focusing on the affirmation, I cherish the moments, I was thinking about what does that mean? To cherish means to hold something dear, right? Cherishing moments as they happen will not only help you feel thankful for your life, but it also helps us be more positive and happy. And at the end of our lives, we don't want to have any regrets. I mean, life is constantly changing. It goes by so fast that many times we aren't even aware that it's happening. Those moments in time become so precious because they're so fleeting. We see how important those moments were. They shape who we are. We build the most intimate connections, moments by moment at a time. By focusing on our positive memories and moments shifts us into gratitude, and being in gratitude feels really good. And every moment is unique. The value of life is priceless. No two people have the same experiences, and each person's journey is as different as a fingerprint. Every person is unique, and since every minute of life is unique, we humans, unfortunately, tend to focus on our problems instead of focusing on what is right in front of us. And I think, and I try to do this in my own life, shift our focus to pay attention to what is working. It's a small shift, but it will have a huge impact on your life. And at the end of our life, we want to have no regrets. And we want to have had experiences that were shared and enriching, and we can think back on those moments with reverence, and we can cherish them. Life is such a beautiful gift. You can have all the money in the world, and that doesn't buy you more time on this planet or more time with your loved ones. So cherish each moment. This ties into our conversation today about grief. Life is so brief and precious, and when we lose someone, what we have are our memories of them, and they become precious, and we cherish them. And our moments get passed down as our stories to our children. It keeps our memories alive, which in my opinion is very, very special. And if you want to see my Magic Monday message postcards, you can go to my website. I share them each week on all my social media platforms. And if you're interested in doing some work, transformation work, inner work exercises, you can check out my book, Postcards to the Universe, Harness the Universe's Power and Manifest Your Dreams, which you can find online at your favorite bookstore. And please, if you are on Facebook, join my Facebook group, Postcards of Love, where we share inspirational messages and beautiful art and photographs, because I love photography. It's just a nice, uplifting group. So find me there, or you can find me on YouTube now. Okay, so next week I have Cass Young, author of 24 books, including her latest, Living the Fairy Life, a guide to connecting with magic, power, and joy of the enchanted realm. So she's really, really interesting, and she offers a lot of things in metaphysics. So join me next week to hear more about Cass. I'm really excited to speak with my guest today, Claire B. Willis, co-author of Opening to Grief, Finding Your Way from Loss to Peace, is a clinical social worker who has worked in the fields of oncology and bereavement for more than 20 years, a co-founder of the Boston nonprofit Facing Cancer Together. Willis has led bereavement, end-of-life support, and therapeutic writing groups. She has taught spiritual resources for healing the mind, body, and soul at Andover Newton Theological School. And as a lay Buddhist chaplain ordained at Upaya Zen Center in Santa Fe, she focuses on contemplative practices for end-of-life care. For the past 5 years, besides Opening to Grief, Willis is the author of Lasting Words, A Guide to Finding Meaning Toward the Close of Life. You can find out more about her book, Opening to Grief, and Claire if you go to her website, openingtogrief.com. Welcome, Claire. Thanks for being here with me.
Thanks for having me, Melissa. I'm glad you have me come.
Good. I don't know. Could you hear me in the beginning, or did you not hear me either?
Yeah, I could hear everything.
Oh, that's so crazy. I don't know what happened, but anyway, it was one of those glitches. So before we get started and we get into grief, I'm curious, because I don't know if a lot of people know what this is. What is contemplative practices for end-of-life care? What is that?
It's using meditation and mindfulness to be with coming to terms with whatever it is, and in this case, it's coming to terms with dying. I think that often what happens when we're frightened is that our minds rush ahead and catastrophize, or we look back and ruminate, and we miss the present moment. We miss the moments that are happening right then. And so in contemplative practices, we try to help people stay in the moment so that they don't sort of lose their life before they die. Because when we're not in the moment, we're really losing our life, actually, when we're not in it.
Yes.
You know, there's some research that's indicated that 50% of the time our minds are in the future, and 40% of the times our mind is in the past. And on a very good day, we are 10% where we are. And so we miss a lot of time. And so by having some contemplative practices, it helps us really absorb and be with the time we have in a fuller way.
Yeah, that's so very true. And I mean, I've gotten better at it. I'm more aware of it, but I notice, if you just think about your life, you're either worried about things you need to get done, or you're thinking about things that happen, and it takes practice for us to be present.
It is a practice, exactly. It takes a lot
I
of
love
practice.
that you're offering that's what you help people with, because you're right. Your life isn't over until it's actually over, right? So if you're in the dying process, as painful and scary as that may be, if you're worrying about the actual moment of your death, you're missing all those moments until then with friends and family too, I'm assuming, right?
That's right. Yes. I actually, right now I'm facilitating a group for people who are dying, and I have a lot of people in it with stage 4 cancer and ALS. And there's a gratitude and joy in this group that I don't see anywhere else. And it's not to say that they're not scared, but they know the value of each moment, because death is on the horizon for all of them. And it's really a beautiful group to be a part of. I feel really privileged to do this work. It's not morbid as one might think, but these people know something about joy and gratitude that I think those of us that aren't living with a life-threatening illness don't know quite the same.
I was going to ask you how that was for you, leading these kinds of groups, and if it was, you said it's very joyous, and most people wouldn't think that. I was going to ask you how that affects you.
Well, actually, I wouldn't call it joyous. I would say that the people in the group know something about joy. They're so grateful to be alive. I find it very, very moving to witness their courage and how they're facing their death and talking so openly with one another about it. The honesty in this group is beautiful, and people are just love one another so much, and they've never met because it's all on Zoom, and it's been on Zoom since January.
Oh, right. So, I'm not even thinking COVID. Yeah. And maybe some people are too sick to leave their homes too. Right.
That's right. So it actually, doing it on Zoom makes it more available to more people. That's one of the benefits of Zoom,
Well, thank you. Yeah, thanks for clarifying that, because it's not joyous isn't the right word. It's gratitude for their. Yeah, I see the difference. I know what you mean.
Yeah.
So what do you mean when you use the word grief? And what is opening to grief?
Most people, grief, I want to give you two definitions of grief, because one of them I really like a lot and I didn't see before we wrote the book. So grief is really any kind of normal and natural response that somebody has to a loss that occurs when a relationship to anything is ruptured, whether it's your job, your home, a person, or whatever. Mm-hmm. Another way of thinking about grief, which I love, was written by somebody named Jamie Anderson, and I haven't been able to find the source for this, but she writes this: grief, I have learned, is really just love. All that unspent love gathers up in the corners of your eyes, the lump in your throat, and in that hollow part of your chest. Grief is just love with no place to go. And I love that definition.
Mm-hmm. It does describe it so well. It really does.
And it also is not something you want to get over, because grief is an expression of loving. But one of the things that I want to say, just to come back to this, what do I mean when I say the word grief? That grief has so many presentations. It has as many presentations as there are people who are grieving. And most of us think of grief as sorrow, sadness, hopelessness, despair. But actually, grief is irritability, it's impatience, it's anger, it's numbness, it's gratitude, it's regret, it's many things. And people don't often recognize. So sometimes I'll hear people say, no one in my family is really grieving. We just lost my mother, and my brother is just going about his life, and he's just a little bit irritable sometimes and angry, and I'm the only one that's carrying sorrow. We tend to think that grief is just sorrow, but it has so many faces, and it becomes a source of conflict in the family when people think they're grieving alone. So if no one else in the family is grieving in the way they are, they tend to think, no, they're alone. And so one of the things we can do is to open up our capacity to see all the expressions that grief can have. And there's just so many. Fear is a big one. Fear and anxiety are big expressions of grief.
Yeah. No, I like that you said that, because it's true. We think that the way we grieve is how everyone else grieves. And so we get frustrated. Right, exactly. We get frustrated when we see someone else not doing it the way, or somebody telling us how to grieve, which is a big, I think, no. You don't tell somebody how they're supposed to grieve.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because this is one of the reasons I wrote the book. So I lead bereavement groups, people who have lost people to cancer. And often people will say something like this: I thought I was doing so well, and then I lost it when I was in the supermarket and I saw a can of tuna fish. And I say, first of all, you are doing well, and just because you had what's called a sudden temporary upsurge of grief, because the tuna fish reminded you of your partner that you lost, it doesn't mean you lost it. You had a moment of getting it, of taking in the full catastrophe of the loss. And most of us can't take it in on a constant basis. So our grief comes in waves. And so when we have a moment where we break down or break open, we think we're going backwards. But we're not. This is just part of the integration process of coming to terms with the fact that you've lost something or someone that's very dear to you. We can't, Stephen Levine, who's written a number of books on death and dying, has a beautiful quote. He says something like, looking at death is like looking at the sun. We look, we turn away, we look, we turn away. Yeah. If we stare at it, we'll burn our eyes. So we have to titrate the loss. We have to let it come in and out. And so when we see that can of tuna that our partner loved, and it catches us off guard, and we have a moment of breaking down. And I think the other thing, Melisa, that I want to just say, which I think is important, is people often compare themselves to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. And those stages of grief were meant for people who were dying. They were never meant to be applied to people who are grieving. Having said that, we often may go through some of those stages or not, but grief is never linear. It's never from A to B to C to D to E. And some people may skip some of those stages. So we may go through some of them, we may not, but they were never meant to be overlaid on people who are grieving. So I want to be sure to say that, because that was one of the reasons we wrote the book, was to try to debunk some of the myths and the ways people compare themselves to what they think they should be doing. And then what happens is they start to shame themselves and they go quiet and secretive about their grief. And that's not good. That's where grief festers.
Yeah. And some people I know circle through those 5 stages of grief over and over and over and over again.
Over and over and over. Well, yes, because grief doesn't ever go away. It just changes in intensity, frequency, and duration. But it doesn't go away because our love for what we've lost doesn't go away. So why would our grief go away? But it changes. It's a little bit like a broken bone. At first, the loss is searing. The bone kills.
Yeah.
Then maybe you put it in a cast, and then maybe you have PT, and then maybe you walk on that leg with that broken bone that's healed. But on rainy days, that you will always have an ache, and it's like loss. There'll always be a lingering ache for whatever you've lost that you've loved.
Yeah, that's a really good way to describe it. Okay, we're going to take our first break here because we're already at the 20-minute mark. So stay tuned, everyone, and we'll be back in just a couple of minutes, and we'll talk more about dealing and opening to our grief.
Conscious media for conscious minds. OMTimes. Host your show on IOM-FM, the radio network of OMTimes Media, one of the more recognized brand names in the conscious community, and is backed by the extensive marketing reach of OMTimes. Hosting a show on IOM-FM immediately connects you with our extensive dedicated community.
Hi, I'm Melisa Caprio from Postcards to the Universe, creating the life you crave. Do you believe in magic? What if I told you all you had to do was get a little creative and work a dream spell to bring anything you can imagine into your life? Well, guess what? I've got the spell for you. Postcards to the Universe, a global movement for manifestation, is a casting magical tool for you to use whenever you want. How does living in passion sound to you? Join me in my movement where you get to create in the magical playground. Let's think outside the box and do some playful conjuring. By casting out our desires with a manifesting postcard, we explore our hearts and allow the alchemy of our dreams to appear. And don't forget to tune in each week here on OMTimes Radio with my show, Postcards to the Universe, creating the life you crave at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. I share tips on creativity, abundance, and prosperity, and you will be introduced to the coolest guests, trailblazers, mystics, and creatives who enrich our lives.
My name is Victor Furman. Some call me The Voice. I've always been fascinated with human nature, spirituality, science, and the crossroads at which they meet. Join me Wednesdays at 8 p.m. Eastern on OMTimes Radio, and we'll explore these topics and so much more on Destination Unlimited.
The rainbow is God's promise of hope for you and me. And though the clouds hang heavy and the sun we cannot see, we know above the dark clouds that fill the stormy sky, hope's rainbow will come shining through when the clouds have drifted by. Teresa Caprio is the president and founder of Rainbow Guardian Inc., a nonprofit 501c3 serving the intellectually challenged/developmentally disabled, including autism. Teresa started the foundation in 1995 so she could help make a better life for her intellectually challenged daughter. Her dream is that the Rainbow Guardian will provide the necessary tools and education to help the public understand the special needs population, because it's often discarded in mainstream society. To find out more or make a donation in support, please go to www.rainbowguardian.org. Rainbow Guardian's special mission is to see these unique people live a happy, full life and have a future of liberty and equality.
All Welcome back. So if you're just joining me, I have Claire B. Willis on, co-author of Opening to Grief, Finding Your Way from Loss to Peace. So Claire, when we're talking about grief before the break, you mentioned this, and I thought this was interesting, what macro losses. So we have our major losses, which is the death of a loved one, obviously. But then you talk about macro losses, and I think a lot of us deal with those on a regular basis. So can you just share a little bit about what that is?
Yeah, the macro losses are really prevalent, I think, in our culture right now. One of the obvious ones is the environmental crisis and what's happening around the world to the environment. And I think it's becoming increasingly more apparent that climate change is, going forward, is going to create devastation even more than it has. We have, I think, one of the more prevalent macro losses right now is the gradual diminishment of our democracy as we're watching different states diminish the capacity for people to vote, and basically the loss of valuing a government run by the people. I think another macro loss that got exposed, it wasn't new, but it got rawly exposed when Floyd was killed. And we've seen how systemic racism is, and how I think some of us have started to see our own complicity in racism as well, even though we don't think of ourselves as racist. But our unconsciousness has certainly exposed us to parts of ourselves that I think many of us didn't look at before. And these are macro losses. Those are some of them.
Yeah. That's why I wanted to ask you that question, because I really am seeing that more now. And do you think that COVID, I don't know the right word to use, but that COVID sort of was the lens for a lot of this, because we were forced to take the step back and isolate?
Yeah, I think the lack of distraction. I mean, we had, I think as a culture, we got a deeper look at ourselves. Right. Through our isolation, and we couldn't distract ourselves from some of the raw realities. And certainly, COVID likely has some environmental roots to it, and environmental destruction of the environment roots in it. And so these things became glaring to us. We are a culture of distraction, and we lost that. And so we were left to sit with what was, and not what we want it to be. It was harder to deny the reality of some of these things.
Yeah, it's gotten much harder. It's much harder to deny the reality. And
it's not easy. It's getting harder now. I think what's going on in our country, in our government, is really stunning. It's just stunning. I mean, who could have imagined this 3 years ago or 2 years ago?
I know. It is. It is. But hopefully shining the light on it will force us to wake up.
Well, that's certainly a good start, because anything that stays in the shadow is not good. One of the things I just want to, along the same lines, COVID really exposed. So first of all, COVID created tendrils of grief everywhere. David Brooks, in a New York Times article that he wrote a year ago, which was a fabulous article, he wrote and asked people how they were faring during the pandemic. And in 3 days, he had 5,000 replies. And he talked about how there was a river of woe, a river of grief flowing through our culture. And I love the idea of a river, because in a river, water reaches everywhere. It reaches everywhere. It saturates everything. And I think all of us were touched in one way or another by COVID. But the other thing that COVID did is it resurrected griefs that we hadn't completely grieved. Yeah. And so I found myself, I know, thinking about my parents who had died and what it would be like for them to have been living through this time and what advice they would give. And I found myself feeling sorrowful at times about that, the loss of that. In a way, they've been gone for years, like 20 years. So I was surprised at the level of sorrow I was still carrying about it.
Yeah. I have heard about that. I've heard that it's resurrected some old grief for
Yes.
people. This time in isolation and contemplative, and and seeing what's happening and hearing the stories. So how does grief manifest in our lives, and how does it?
Well, there's a whole lot of ways it manifests. I mean, cognitively, it can manifest in an inability to concentrate. We are forgetful, we're distracted, we can't focus. And then, of course, some of those other things I already mentioned, we might get irritable, angry. We can't, a lot of people talked with me about how they couldn't read a book any longer. They could only read short articles in the face of grief. And a lot of that came out of COVID. It might express itself with over-exercising, under-exercising, being lethargic, being hyperactive, the extremes of behaviors. We saw overeating, not having any appetite. A lot of people during COVID certainly talked about gaining weight. There was a lot of joking about that on the media.
The COVID-15, like when you went to college, when they said the freshman 15, they said the COVID-15. Yeah, I heard that.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Yeah. And then I think spiritually, people who have losses that come through trauma, like I had a woman the other day whose son was murdered, have a shattering of faith. I think that grief can shatter our faith, especially if it disrupts a fundamental order of things. So, for instance, a child being murdered is a terrible fundamental disruption. I mean, it's just unspeakable grief. So it's not the same as losing a 100-year-old grandparent. It's just different. It shatters your faith, and that's really been painful to see that. But one of the things that I think is just important to name, Melisa, is that one of the ways to help with your grief is by naming your grief. And I'd love to just read a very short poem by Carol Lynn Knight called Naming. And I love this because it speaks to what we're saying. If I name this grief, define it without guilt and redemption, call it drowning, desolation, call it fire and stone, then I am bound to care for it. Like a stray cat I name, the demands I feed him. He comes and goes, sometimes disappears for days and then returns, insisting that I remember. And I think this poem, to that point of COVID resurrecting old griefs, if we don't allow ourselves to be with our losses, they do not go away. They will pop their heads up sideways in different ways for the rest of our life until we give it the kindness and the attention that it needs. We need to take care of it in the same way we would a child who is hurting.
That's a beautiful poem. Isn't
that a beautiful poem?
Yeah, it really is. So, I kind of want to hit on this because I've noticed this personally, and I know I've talked to other people, and it's about grief. So you're grieving the loss of a relationship because you're divorced, right? But the relationship was not a healthy relationship, and there was a lot of abuse in the relationship, right? So you're grieving that, but then you don't when somebody passes away, you like to talk about the memories of that person, right? That brings you comfort on some level. But when it's a painful relationship and it's a divorce, those memories are painful. So how do we deal with that? Because it's a very different way to grieve. And a lot of people don't see that as grieving the same way, unless you're going through it.
It is different. It is very different. I think sometimes divorcing you can grieve for let's just say, for the marriage you weren't able to materialize. You're not necessarily grieving for the person. Right. Having said that, even in an abusive relationship, there are invariably some good moments or some good things that happened. And so you might be grieving those things, even though it's absolutely perfect that you're not in this relationship anymore. I had a woman in one of my bereavement groups say something interesting the other night. She said, more than missing my partner, I miss being part of a couple. So that's something that people might grieve, leaving an abusive relationship. There's a phenomenon called secondary losses in the literature, which I think is really an important thing just to mention here. So let's just say you lose someone either to divorce, even if it's a destructive relationship or to death. You have the loss of the person, your partner, either through divorce or death. But you also have what's called a number of secondary losses. So for a woman leaving a partner, she may lose economic stability. She may lose a lot of friends. Some of her friends are going to come forward. Some of them are going to disappear. She may lose a co-parent, a role as a co-parent. She may lose a future traveling companion. She may lose her role as a caregiver or as a wife. She may lose her identity as being in a partnership. So even though something is right, there are often losses that circle around that primary loss, which are called secondary losses, but they are not secondary in impact. In fact, sometimes those losses are even more primary than the loss of the person.
Yeah, especially
and they're not
with
acknowledged.
children and economic stability. Yeah, sure.
And a lot of people have to move when they break up a relationship, whether it's abusive or not.
Yeah, I had to. I left a marriage, I moved, and a job in 30 days. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so I was grieving for a long time. This was years ago. I'm much better now. I'm through the grief now, but yeah, it was years ago.
Yeah,
yeah, it was very traumatic.
There's always the grief for what you couldn't materialize.
Yes.
What couldn't happen that you aspired to.
Yeah, that's a big part of it. It's grieving the idea of what you wanted it to look like. That's a big one, and people don't realize that. Yeah.
Yeah. I felt that when my mother died, that I felt like I grieved the mother I needed and didn't have. And I grieved my mother, but I also grieved the mother I wished I'd had.
Yes, that's it. I grieved the relationship and the husband that I wished I had.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a very interesting perspective.
They're very important griefs to acknowledge, and they often don't get named. They come into the category of what's called ambiguous grief, where there's two kinds of ambiguous grief, which are really kind of interesting. One is the person is physically present but psychologically absent. So that could be someone who's autistic, or someone who's in an addiction process, or someone who's had a mental illness. They're physically there, but they're psychologically not there. Or you have someone who's psychologically with you, but physically absent. And that is a loss like divorce and separation.
Yeah. No, it's
people who
so
are deported. But they're not losses that we think to name, because we think in terms of death when we think about losses. But there's so many losses that are non-death losses that impact us deeply. One of them, another loss actually that I just want to mention because it's so often overlooked, and it's what I call one of these disenfranchised griefs in our culture, which our culture doesn't pay attention to, is pet loss.
Oh,
and
for sure.
The love people have for a pet is pure, it's simple, and it's generally unconditional. And when a pet dies that's been a furry companion for 12 or 14 years, it's devastating. It is devastating for the person who owned that.
Oh,
and
yes.
And there's no holding for that environment. There's no one that comes around and says, oh, let us gather around and spread the ashes, or let's have a ritual to honor the passage of your pooch. There's nothing. And it's a very lonely grief. And I think part of what makes grief linger is when it's not acknowledged. There's no social context for holding it.
It's so true that you said that. And I had a friend, and he lost his cat, and he was devastated. I mean, just devastated.
Yeah.
I was on the phone with him all the time, and because he loved that cat, and that was his companion, and it broke my heart, for him.
Right.
And this is interesting that we're talking live on the air. So if anybody's listening, hey, it's an untapped resource to help people. Somebody could start a group.
My sister recently lost her 14-year companion, and she's 80. And she said to me, "You're the only person I would tell this to, but I'm sleeping with his favorite toy." And I thought to myself, what's sad to me is that she doesn't feel she can tell people what she's
right.
doing. And the thing of it is, you get into a pet bereavement group and you won't believe what people are doing. Everybody's doing those kinds of things, but no one's talking about them. And that's what's so sad. Or in my bereavement group, I'll hear someone say, I'm sleeping with my husband's shirt because I miss the scent of him. Sure. And I'll say to the group, how many of you are talking to your beloveds who are gone? I don't say, is anybody? I assume that everybody is, and I give them permission to speak it. And the secrecy and the privatization of pain in our culture is one of the most painful things that disrupts and obstructs grief. Everything's private, and that's why I think bereavement groups are so important, because people can finish each other's sentences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I wonder why that is, because if we live a long enough life, we're going to have grief in our life at some point, somewhere. So the fact that it still sits in secrecy and privacy to the degree that people feel shameful it's just very, I just don't understand it.
Well, I think if we really gave grief full voice, our economics culture couldn't live the way it thrives.
Couldn't withstand it.
You think companies give 3, 4, 5 days when you've lost someone.
Wow.
That's all they acknowledge it. And truth is, we're impacted for the rest of our life. 3 to 4, 5 days isn't even enough time to realize what happened.
Yeah, no, you're right. Okay, we're at the second break time, so let's take it now, because I have a lot more questions I want to talk about with you about grief. So stay tuned, and I'll be back in just a couple of minutes with Claire Willis, and we're going to continue our conversation on grief.
The Real Conscious Connection. OMTimes Radio. IOM FM. OMTimes Magazine is one of the leading online content providers of positivity, wellness, and personal empowerment. A philanthropic organization, their net proceeds are funneled to support worldwide charity initiatives via Humanity Healing International. Through their commitment to creating community and providing conscious content, they aspire to uplift humanity on a global scale. OMTimes, co-creating a more conscious lifestyle.
Imagine yourself being transported to India, to the banks of the Ganga and an ashram in Rishikesh. Visualize that you are welcome to satsang with an American sannyasi who shares the wisdom of her guru. Your visualization has manifested. Join Sattvi Bhagawati Saraswati for inspiration and transformation every Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern on OMTimes Radio.
Hi, I'm Melisa Caprio from Postcards to the Universe, creating the life you crave. Do you believe in magic? What if I told you all you had to do was get a little creative and work a dream spell to bring anything you can imagine into your life? Well, guess what? I've got the spell for you. Postcards to the Universe, a global movement for manifestation, is a casting magical tool for you to use whenever you want. How does living in passion sound to you? Join me in my movement where you get to create in the magical playground. Let's think outside the box and do some playful conjuring. By casting out our desires with a manifesting postcard, we explore our hearts and allow the alchemy of our dreams to appear. And don't forget to tune in each week here on OMTimes Radio with my show, Postcards to the Universe, creating the life you crave at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. I share tips on creativity, abundance, and prosperity, and you will be introduced to the coolest guests, trailblazers, mystics, and creatives who enrich our lives.
Coping-19, brought to you by CDC and the Ad Council.
If you're feeling increasingly lonely right now, you're not alone. It's totally normal. Even though we may not be able to get together in person, connecting virtually with friends and family still gives you a chance to interact with people and may help raise your spirits. Join a virtual book club, set up group text chats, or online video coffee breaks with coworkers.
Find more self-care and coping tips at coping-19.org.
Welcome back. So, Claire, I was thinking, what would you say to someone who says that they'll never get over losing someone that they loved?
You won't.
You won't. Yeah, I know.
You won't.
That's what I
It's
read.
true.
And it is true. Mm-hmm.
You won't. And you shouldn't, because love doesn't go away. It changes, and the grief changes. You will not feel the way you do the first or second or third or fourth day you've lost somebody. It will change. But you don't get over. You learn to carry grief as a companion and to trust it and to treat grief kindly. It's so important to be tender towards your grief and care for it, because otherwise, as I read in that poem earlier, like a stray cat, it will come back over and over and over, demanding that you feed it and care for it.
Yeah, it's calling for you to care for it.
Yes.
Yeah. And so can somebody get stuck in the grieving process or get stuck in their own grief?
I think you can get stuck if you refuse to be with it, and you can get stuck if you medicate it. But I think if you allow yourself to be with your grief will move through you, because it is an expression of your loving. And I think that's such a beautiful way to think about grief, because it takes away any shame or disparagement anybody might have about their grief. You know, it's a sacred process to be grieving. It's not fun and it's not easy, but to allow your heart to break open will allow you to connect with other people who have had bad losses. Because one of the things that happens to people who are grieving is that invariably, whether it's divorce or death, your friendships all change, and that's been a very painful thing. And part of the reason that happens is because people don't know their way around their own grief, and so they can't be with yours. We can't be with another if they're exhibiting a part of themselves that we can't accept in ourselves. So by being with our own grief, we become conduits of love and presence and generosity to other people who are grieving. We know what they need, and we know how to be with people.
Yeah. And so what would you say to somebody? And actually, I remember asking this question to a friend when I was in really in a lot of pain. I remember this. Will it always feel this painful? I remember asking my friend that when I was really, right when it was fresh, you know? So what advice would you give to somebody?
It will not always feel this painful. And over time, it will change, as I said earlier, in intensity, in frequency of occurring, and duration, the amount of time. It will change. And what happens is that you begin to, at first when you lose somebody or you have a loss that's consequential, the walls in your house become gray, the floor becomes gray, the ceiling is gray, everything is gray, because you're living in a colorless world. You're living in a shock and numbness and the devastation of a loss. And over time, color slowly starts to come back into the room as different resources for holding your grief enter your life. But always, always, there's a chair in the corner that will remain for you to grieve in. One chair will remain gray. It's a little bit like what I said about a broken bone. On rainy days, it will ache. It will never completely go away, but it certainly changes incredibly from a searing pain to more of a dull ache that just visits you infrequently, occasionally, I should say.
Yeah, I love that you wrote this and you use this analogy. You said, grief can be like a very messy room in our house. It's best to enter slowly and pick up one item at a time. If we try to face and take in the entire room at once, we can become overwhelmed and paralyzed by the magnitude and intensity of our feelings and by all that rich stuff that's there. And I really like the description, because it is like that. You're taking one. It comes in waves. It comes a little at a time, and you take what you can handle. I kind of feel like forgiveness is a lot like that. You forgive just a little at a time. You know, it's not an all at once kind of thing. At least in my experience, I mean, when I've had deaths and losses, I remember it came to me in waves. I would have good days, and then all of a sudden a memory, something would come, and it would whoosh.
That's right. And that is normal. And I just want to emphasize that, because so often people pathologize themselves when that happens.
Right.
It is completely normal.
Yeah. Yeah, it's completely normal. And I know you talk about like, you know, a timetable or a path and, you know, what can people expect? And I think that we have to be super careful too that, you know, let's say you lose, you know, somebody to divorce or death and a couple years goes by and, you know, your friends or family, oh, well, don't you think you should be over it by now? I think that's a terrible thing to say to somebody and very hurtful. Yeah. What would your comments on that be?
I would say to someone, I will never get over it.
Yeah.
It's more a statement of their inability to be with you in your pain than it is anything about you. It's really a statement about the person who's making that comment. And it's really unfortunate. People say things that aren't helpful. And in fact, let me just pause here and say the most important thing you can offer someone who's grieving is to offer them your presence, to be willing to listen to them, to invite them to speak about their loss. I understand you're in the middle of a divorce. What is most difficult about this? Ask people to talk about it. Your mother died. Tell me, what are some of the memories that are sticking with you that are sources of comfort? Or I'd like to hear about your mother as much as you would like to say. Or you're not going crazy. Your grief is normal. You're grieving in the way you need to grieve. You know, not overlaying models, not overlaying judgments on one another, because there are as many different expressions of grief as there are people who are grieving. And I can't say that enough. And the pathologizing of grief in our culture is really a terrible thing. And it becomes an obstruction to grief because people shame themselves and go under and keep what they're doing under the covers. And that is really the tragedy of grief. And I think one of the good things about COVID is that it's brought the idea of grief, it's brought articles into the foreground, it's brought the word grief into the culture, and it's much more acceptable to talk about it now, and we're getting more educated about it.
Yes, and I think when we repress things, it makes us sick. That's what I think personally.
It creates dis-ease in us, and it compromises our immune system. Because we use all that energy to inhibit intense feelings. But I think one of the things I just want to say before we end here, Melissa, which I think is important, is that this book offers, each chapter is a resource for holding grief so that grief can work through you and open you and change your life in ways that you can't even begin to imagine. So each chapter offers a resource for you to strengthen yourself in the face of loss and become more resilient.
Yeah, I was going to actually, it's so funny that you said that because my next question was going to be about your meditation. So you co-wrote the book with author Marnie Crawford Samuelson, and both of you are Buddhists, and you offer several meditations and mindfulness practices to help us through our grief in the book. So can you share a little bit about how that can help us deal with or be present with our grief?
Well, let me just say that each chapter is a resource for being with our grief. And we start the book with talking about being with kindness. And then we talk about creating a gratitude practice, opening to mindfulness and meditation, the importance of restoring in nature, the importance of community, making art, and writing as a source of refuge. And each chapter closes with a meditation that relates to the content of the chapter. And the meditation that we use is called metta meditation, which means loving kindness or tender friends. So one of the ways, so for instance, in one of the beginning chapters called Meeting Grief as a Companion, we close with this meditation. These are, metta meditation is our aspirations. This is one example in the first chapter. May I welcome all my feelings as I grieve. May I allow grief to soften and strengthen my heart. May I hold my sorrow with tenderness and compassion. So those are the meditations in the chapter called Meeting Grief as a Companion. So each one we close with these aspirations. They're like little self-blessings to offer to yourself in times of distress.
Yeah, I love that you talk about exploring and using your creativity, because that's my go-to, because I have an art background in photography, so I use my creativity for everything. That's like a tool in my life, and I love that you talk about you don't have to be an artist. You don't have to be good.
No.
It's just tapping into your creativity and how that helps you hold the grief. I would say,
Yes.
right? Hold it.
Well,
Yeah,
I
hold
think
it.
a lot of people aren't always verbal. So art gives us a nonverbal way to work imagistically and in other ways, using the other side of the brain to integrate our grief. And not everybody is verbal about their grief. And so this is a more reflective way to see what are the healing images you can pull up, or what are the images of remembrance that you want to make sure to make note. One of the things that I hear a lot in my bereavement groups is this phrase, I never want to forget. I want to remember. And I'll often say, you will forget. So let's think about what you can do right now to increase the likelihood of remembering. That's really important. And art frequently comes up. You know, people make little altars or triptychs for their loved ones, or some people will sew things from shirts or a quilt that their partner wore. You know, there's all kinds of ways to do that.
Yeah, and I you talk about the people finding solace in writing, and I heard this story somewhere a while ago, and I cannot remember the source, so excuse me, but I remember somebody talking about they lost someone very special in their life. I think it was a parent, and what they did is they wrote letters to the parent, but then what they did from there is they wrote back to themselves from the parent's perspective.
That's right.
And I thought, wow, what an interesting...
Well, see, there's a lot of research about this. There's two phenomena that speak to this. One is a phenomenon called continuing bonds, which acknowledges the fact that just because someone died doesn't mean the relationship is over.
Right.
So it's sort of like when I say in my group, how many of you are talking to your loved ones? It's talking through writing. I often encourage people to write letters to their loved ones and to keep a grief journal. You know, starting out with something I wish I could have shared with you today is, and just writing it out. And then if you get a response that comes through, that you feel comes through the voice of your loved one, write it out. Or perhaps your loved one comes to you in your dream life. I hear that a lot. Or perhaps you saw something that happened today that you felt was a sign from your loved one. Write about that. I hear that a lot, often in the form of birds or feathers. Or one of the women in my group whose husband was like an arborist, she said her house was filled with plants, and she had some plant that only blooms once every 7 years. And apparently after her partner died, the plant bloomed for the second year in a row. It was like this freak thing, and she felt that it was her husband, you know, expressing himself through the plants. So people find beautiful ways to make meaning of their losses. And whether it's scientifically accurate or not, it doesn't matter. What matters is that you make meaning in a way that offers you comfort. Finding a way.
I love that. I love those stories. Every time we see a certain butterfly, the monarch, I always say it's my grandmother. My mom always says that's her mother.
You go.
Like, it's always her passing us a little visit. We only have like a minute and a half. Is there anything that you really think is important that you want to leave us with that we should know?
Well, you know, I would go back to where I started, and I would say, remember that grief is just your love with no place to go. And so take good care of it. Let it find expression. Don't try to banish it. Just allow yourself to be with it. And I would hope that the chapters in our book would strengthen one's ability to be with their grief and hold it and treat it with honor and compassion and kindness.
That's really beautiful. And Claire, thank you so much for being here with me today. And you guys, check out Claire's book, Opening to Grief. I think it's really important. All of us are grieving at some point about something in our lives, right? Or at some time. So I really like, that you're helping us deal with our grief. And the work that you do is incredible. So thank you so much for that.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Melissa, and allowing me to convey the message of the book to your listeners?
It's important. It's important that we honor, our feelings. It's important that we honor who we are. It's important that we honor our grief. So thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, guys. So this is a really great show and very informative. So thank you all for listening to Postcards to the Universe with Melisa, creating the life you crave. And I'm wishing everyone a wonderful week filled with joy, abundance, and love. Peace.